Welcome to Who Shaves the Barber, a weekly podcast where we explore paradoxes, thought experiments, and other pointless problems. I'm William Nava. The case for anarchism. One of my favorite topics, a topic that I've thought a lot about. So first thing I want to say about it is just to clarify what I mean by anarchism. Because anarchism is a word that has all kinds of associations in, the popular consciousness. So let me just be very clear what I mean when I say I'm making a case for anarchism. I am making a case for getting rid of the state. For getting rid of government. Okay? That is as distinct from chaos and fire in the streets and whatever else people may have kind of as automatic associations with anarchism. Okay? In fact, part of what I'm going to argue is that getting rid of the state, living in a stateless society, amounts to living in a much less chaotic world. And I'll obviously I have to make my case for why that would be. Another kind of important thing to sort of emphasize is that when I say getting rid of the state, that's very specific. That's given a very specific definition of what the state is. Okay, so I'm going to provide that definition, and then it's going to be getting rid of that specifically that I'm going to be talking about. And now, again, as distinct from anything else that might be associated when we just think, what does getting rid of the state entail? Now, this is going to be mostly an a priori argument, or almost a priori, right? I mean, from certain basic definitions of what the state is, as well as basic assumptions about what most people's ethical intuitions are. I'm going to be making the case that essentially that the case for the state is fundamentally an argument from necessary evil. Okay, that if we just take into account what the state actually is by definition and what most of us sort of intuitively feel ethically, that the state is necessarily an evil, and we think we should have it because we think it's a necessary evil, right? That it's, even though it's an evil, it's something that we need, because if we didn't accept it, then we'd have even worse evils. Okay, so I'm going to make the case that that's actually the only reason anybody supports the state, whether or not they're conscious of it, that's actually the motivation to support the state, is that it's a necessary evil. And then I'm going to try to show that it is not in fact necessary. Okay, that getting rid of it would not actually cause things even worse than what it is. And so that's all I'll need for my argument that we should get rid of the damn thing. Again, so it's mostly going to be an a priori argument. Now, I should say, there are sort of empirical components that I'm not going to dig into very deeply here. I'm going to, in the notes, leave some sources, so for you to go take a look at some of the kind of empirical counterparts to the argument that I'm making. I don't think that the argument I'm making here by itself is dispositive. However, I think the argument here, combined with some important empirical information, is in fact dispositive. And unlike some of the other things that I've talked about, this is actually one area where I feel quite confident that the argument that I'm making is correct. Although, as always, I'd love to hear people's objections and counter-arguments. Now, I'm going to start with a bit of a digression, something kind of a bit of a parable, although it's actually a true story. It might as well be a parable. It's the rather famous story of the Stanford Prison Experiment. So I take it most people have heard of the Stanford Prison Experiment, so I'm going to kind of quickly go over what it was, and as I push forward my case, I think it'll become clearer why I'm choosing to start with this seeming digression. So the Stanford Prison Experiment was a psychological experiment that took place in 1971. And it was led by a psychologist named Philip Zimbardo. This is what he did. He found himself 14 college-age males after surveying some number of candidates. And these 14 college-age males were vetted to make sure that they were fully sort of psychologically healthy, seemed like well-adjusted members of society. And they were offered $15 a day to partake in a 2-week-long prison simulation. So the plan was, on the Stanford University campus, they would fashion a prison, and 7 of these 14 students would be assigned the role of prisoner, and 7 of them would be assigned the role of guard, and the assignments were totally random. And then for those 2 weeks, Zimbardo and his team would just document what happens. So that was the plan, and that's actually how things started. The experiment, as most people know, was a complete disaster. Whereas it was planned for 2 weeks, it had to be shut down after 6 days because of the humanitarian disaster that the experiment had become. So just to kind of quickly go through some of the examples of some of what went on during the experiment, the guards treated the prisoners with an incredible amount of cruelty. They imposed all kinds of punishments on them. So exercise regimes, forced them to go into solitary. They actually fashioned a solitary confinement chamber out of a closet and forced the prisoners to go in there, humiliated them, forced them to get naked in front of each other, forced them to be in the same room as their waste. So there was a waste bucket, and they sort of kept the bucket in the common area. They removed their mattresses, attacked the prisoners with a fire extinguisher. The list kind of goes on and on of the things that the guards sort of did to the prisoners. Now, that's sort of, this is a commonly known story. There were, by the second day, there were 2 prisoners that had to be removed because they essentially had nervous breakdowns. Another interesting thing that the guards did is that they started to engage in kind of psychological warfare against the prisoners, so that no solidarity would arise between the prisoners, by treating some of the prisoners preferentially and some others more terribly than the others. They kind of created factions between the prisoners in order to have the prisoners also turn against each other, as well as do things like but if one prisoner wasn't playing along the right way, punish the rest of them, so that again they would turn on each other. This sort of thing. So this is common knowledge, right? This story, and the story understandably tends to focus on the horrendous actions of the guards, right? And sort of the cliche is, what would you do if you were a guard in that situation? And this kind of harkens back to questions that we often ask ourselves about, how would I have acted if I was an officer in a concentration camp, that sort of thing. And that, I think, is all insightful and makes sense. What I find actually very interesting, though, is to look at the actions of the prisoners, right? So just as incredible as it is to sort of fathom that the guards acted with the amount of cruelty that they did, it's interesting to note the amount of compliance that the prisoners acted with, right? So everybody here knew that they were being part of an experiment, of a simulation. They presumably remembered that they were still on the United States and that afforded them certain rights. However, the prisoners, by and large, complied. They stayed. One of the most telling moments of the 6-day run was when fake parole hearings were staged. And in these fake parole hearings, the prisoners were offered to be allowed to walk away in exchange for giving up their pay. So presumably they're doing this for $15 a day. That was the deal. And they were basically told, if we don't pay you, we'll let you walk. And most of them, I don't remember the exact number, but most of them agreed to that deal. Okay, so the only reason, in theory, that they're doing this at all is for the pay. And yet they're saying, if I can walk, I'll give up my pay. Although, obviously, they must have realized on some level that they could walk anyway. I mean, they're not actually in a prison, right? And yet it seems to be that the environment of the prison experiment was so powerful that it had them sort of behave in this way where they were even willing to give up their pay just to be allowed to leave. Even though, again, obviously, if they had insisted enough, right, they obviously would have been able to walk, given that they were still rights-bearing citizens of the United States. Another interesting aspect of this is the way that it affected the people running the experiment. So Zimbardo has written about how the experiment affected him. He played the part of the warden, and he found himself kind of getting sucked into this role of the warden, to the point where, after one of those prisoners was removed for having a nervous breakdown, Zimbardo became convinced that he was planning to come back and stage a prison break. And Zimbardo became so concerned about this that he took down the simulation and recreated it on a separate floor in order to avoid this escape plan that he feared one of the prisoners or ex-prisoners might be trying to stage. And this to say nothing of the fact that he was witnessing these, terrible humanitarian rights violations and was just sort of letting it go. I'm going to ask now, this may seem odd, I'm going to ask now that you simply keep this in the back of your mind as we now dive into the actual argument for anarchism. And I'm going to explain shortly, I'll actually address directly why I wanted to open with this. But moving on now to the actual argument for anarchism. It's going to have to start by addressing the question of what the state is, right? So I said when I'm arguing for anarchism, I'm simply saying we got to get rid of this specific thing called the state. So what am I talking about? What actually is the state? So the traditional view, I shouldn't say the traditional view because there are more than one view, but the closest thing that I have found to a consensus view on what the state is a definition given by Max Weber. Max Weber calls the state a human community that successfully claims monopoly over the legitimate use of physical force within a given territory. So I think that this is a very insightful and in some ways correct definition of the state. However, I think that there are serious problems with it. Here is one obvious problem with it. So Weber's definition identifies the human community as the state, right? So it's a human community that takes such and such an action, right? Successfully claims the monopoly over So he identifies the state with a particular human community within some given territory. The problem with this is that for any given state, say for example the United States, the human community in charge, presumably the politicians, change over time, right? So anybody in power a few generations ago was mostly not in power anymore, dead, what have you, and yet we still have the United States. There's a continuity over time of the state that isn't captured by identifying the state with some particular human community. There's a more serious problem. That one may seem kind of pedantic. Here's what I think is a more serious problem. If we're trying to identify who actually controls the state apparatus, right? Whatever this thing is that we're trying to identify. So who are the people that really control it? Weber's definition would really seem to suggest there's a specific group, presumably the politicians, right? Or maybe not only the politicians, but presumably there's this kind of group, this community that is successfully claiming this monopoly, therefore having this kind of power. However, this doesn't seem to actually reflect the facts. So in two ways. One is the people whom we would expect to have this power, the politicians, don't actually seem to have that much power over how the government is directed. So if you look at the United States and you look at the people that are most powerful in the United States government, so let's take a look at the president, right? Donald Trump. So Donald Trump may seem like a very powerful guy, and in some respects, of course, he is. And yet he has relatively little power to actually direct the direction of the government. I mean, of course, he has some say, but it's extremely, extremely limited. It's limited by the various political compromises that he has to make, right? By the various different kind of checks and balances that are around him, the fact that he has to coordinate with Congress and different branches and diplomatic concerns, and also, very importantly, the fact that he presumably wants to get reelected. The fact that his party wants the party senators and party congressmen and party governors to also be reelected or be elected. And so all of that places huge, huge constraints on what Donald Trump can do. Even more fundamentally, though, consider the fact that Donald Trump, he's actually, I think, a really great example, because Donald Trump, in a sense, seems like a very unique character in American politics. He's like this new phenomenon that seemed to have like hacked the political system and kind of made it his own in a way. And yet, there's an important sense in which he had no control over the socio-political forces that made it so that somebody like him was electable. Okay? So what did Donald Trump do? Donald Trump successfully noticed that there was a kind of, character that he could fill that was actually electable. And he did that expertly. However, he had no power over the fact that was the case, right? That there was a kind of Trump-shaped hole that he could come in and fill. Again, so the actual person, Donald Trump, couldn't just direct the government as he would any kind of whimsical thing, right? He actually has the constraints on what would be intelligent for him to do, given his desires to maintain political power and of his party to maintain political power, and what he's actually allowed to do, given the various political constraints around him, mean that there's actually really relatively little that he can actually do. That's one side of the problem. The people supposedly in power have a lot less power than they seem to. The other side of the coin is that kind of everyday people do have some power, right? So a low-level bureaucrat working in some government agency has some small amount of power to direct government apparatus, even in some specific case, right? So somebody is filing a petition for immigration, and some low-level bureaucrat has discretion over where that goes, right? That's actually directing the government apparatus. And even voters, however small, do have some power to direct the government apparatus. So obviously, the level of power that the low-level bureaucrat and the voter have versus Donald Trump is quite different, right? But given everything I've just said, it seems to me that it's really one of degree, not really of kind. The degree may be quite vast, right? But they both have quite little power to actually affect the direction of government. One of them much less than the other. But still, again, difference seems to be of degree rather than of kind. So I think these points sort of create a problem with the idea of identifying the state with a particular human community. There's another problem to point out, and that is just the problem of levels of perspective. And here's what I mean by that. If you're analyzing a society on a kind of political level, maybe a level of kind of ethics on a mass scale, then it makes sense to view things like, here's this one group, they seem to have power, they tell the other group, the other group that doesn't have the power, what to do. And that obviously seems to create this political way of looking at the society that more or less maybe seems kind of like it conforms to Weber's definition. However, what happens if we look at society not from this political perspective, but more from an anthropological or sociological perspective? What we see, my claim is that what we see is that human societies and human communities tend to organize themselves in a way that's consistent with certain patterns, patterns of behavior. And again, if we look at this, let's say that we are analyzing some species of animals. Maybe we're analyzing bees, and we look at the way that they behave with each other. We may notice hierarchical structures. And yet, our tendency, right, our instinct is not to look at it from this sort of political perspective. And, one of them has the power, the others don't. But really, we tend to just look at it as, that's what this species does. They organize themselves in this kind of way. There are always some members of the species that play this type of role, and there's some members of the species that play this type of role. I think if we look at human communities that way, we see that we tend to organize ourselves around states. And some people sort of fill the role of being in the buildings that are symbols of that state, and then other people play the role of paying taxes or what have you. It sort of, looking at it from this perspective, simply takes out a little bit that notion of there's power here, and simply, I think, a little bit more of a broader perspective, a more neutral way of looking at the fact that this is just the kinds of patterns that human beings tend to organize themselves around. That does not in any way disprove the political perspective. It's really a different perspective that I'm claiming is a bit broader, kind of higher level perspective of what's going on. But certainly both are consistent. And that distinction between the two kinds of perspectives, I think, gives me a good segue to now propose what I think is the correct definition of the state. Now, so what I think is the correct definition of the state is very much parasitic on Weber's. But it kind of takes the kernel that Weber's definition gives and kind of pulls it out into this kind of broader level perspective that's a bit more sociological and a bit less political. So here's what I think the state is. I think it's a combination of two things. A state is a pattern of behaviors, in particular a pattern of behaviors that conforms to Weber's definition. In other words, it conforms to there being this human community that so-and-so, along with a collective interpretive framework that interprets that pattern of behaviors. So that's a mouthful, and it's like weirdly recursive. So let me spell out all the different components of it. So first, the pattern of behaviors, right? So pattern of behaviors, I just mean part of what you need to have a state is that people behave in such a way that a pattern arises, and this pattern is consistent with Weber's definition. In other words, the pattern of behaviors is the kind of pattern of behaviors that you can interpret as there's this human community that so and so and so, and the pattern more or less fits that, right? The way that people actually behave more or less fits that. Let me just say now why I think that already by itself is not enough. It's because in a way, Weber's definition, there was an aspect of it that was actually a little bit too broad. It catches a bit too much. Consider things like mafias, like religious cults. These are different ways that you could interpret the bare minimum given to us by Weber's definition. So if you look at how mafias work, right? With the mafia, you do have this human community that within the larger community that is under the mafia's sort of reign of control, right, do have a monopoly on legitimate use of force, legitimized, again, by all those people who are, again, under the sort of reach of the mafia. And again, the same happens with religious cults, right? So I think that Jonestown is the most obvious example where, again, you have a clear territory and you have this small community who have this sort of power to enforce the way that things are supposed to go for the other people in the reach of the cult, legitimized again by the cult members. So my point is that the difference between a state and a religious cult and a mafia might be kind of blurry. At best, it might seem at this point, given what I've said, that maybe it's one of scale, right? Governments tend to involve much larger pieces of territory. And then also, you might say that governments maybe are just a bit more successful. But here's where the collective interpretive framework comes in. Because the collective interpretive framework makes it clearer what actually distinguishes a state from some of the other things that I mentioned. So the collective interpretive framework, let me just throw out each of those words, right? So by an interpretive framework, I mean a way of interpreting reality. Here, I think it is really useful to use the kind of cliche of the, you put on your green tinted glasses, and then after a long time you stop seeing green, right? That's just how the world looks. I think collective interpretive frameworks are basically the different tinted glasses that we have for interpreting the basic facts about life and the world and our society. So there are things that we learn at a very, very early age that are just the fundamentals of how it is that our world operates. And collective just means that it's shared, right? That this interpretive framework is shared by enough people that it's just sort of taken for granted on an interpersonal and social level within societies. And that's the kind of thing that makes societies these cohesive entities and not just different people just totally off doing their own things. Here's what I want to say about the collective interpretive framework that specifically applies to the state. I'm going to say that it has 4 essential components. Other than, again, it interprets the pattern of behaviors that is defining of the state as this specific human community, right? This specific group that has power. So the collective interpretive framework, in a way, takes this sort of neutral sociological phenomenon, which is just patterns of behaviors, and it interprets it down to the political level, and again, shared by society as a whole. Besides that, it's got 4 important components. It interprets this state, this powerful human community, what have you, as being necessary, inevitable, legitimate, and real. If we just look at those, right? So in terms of how most people feel, not just how people within one particular society or one particular group, one particular state, but how actually most people in the world see things. Things like mafias and cults are not necessary. But there's nothing like it's not like we need them for society to function. They're not inevitable, right? They are kind of this contingent thing that happens. And in most cases, we kind of are trying to get rid of them and wish we could. So nothing inevitable about them. Very much not legitimate, right? That actually is kind of the really fundamental one. They're not legitimate. And they are real. So the real part is not any different when it comes to cults and religion, cults and mafias. However, when we think about states, when we think about governments, we are convinced it is a fundamental aspect of how we view these things, that they are necessary, inevitable, legitimate, and real. Okay, we think that, for the most part, if the government were not around, there would be chaos and mass murder on the streets and what have you. We also just tend to think that this will always happen. This is the thing that kind of is inevitable, also very much legitimate, right? There's social contract theory that legitimizes states, but then also there's just a kind of gut feeling and basic assumption that these things are legitimate. And we're very much just raised with that idea. And then real, that one just seems obvious, right? Like it might seem kind of weird that I'm even mentioning real because what are you talking about? Of course they're real. So let me quickly sum up here. All right, so far what I've proposed is that what the state is it breaks down into 2 things: a pattern of behaviors and an interpretation of that pattern of behaviors. The pattern, just all we need to know, the only requirement is that it actually conforms more or less to Weber's definition, that people behave in a way that could be described as that. The other, and then the collective interpretive framework, the other component is this interpretation of the pattern that says, hey, look, what this pattern is that there's this group of people, they have power, and those people, some group of people being in that position is something that's necessary, inevitable, legitimate, and most definitely real. Here now is where, so let me now point out this interesting relationship between the real component of the collective interpretive framework and the pattern of behaviors. It is the fact that we interpret the state as being real that causes us to act in such a way that the pattern of behaviors that is constitutive of the state manifests. Let me repeat that. That was very much a mouthful. So, because we think the state is real, we take certain actions that are consistent with that belief. Actions like, for example, sending our kids to public school, paying our taxes, putting on our police uniforms if we happen to be police officers, and whatever other things that we associate with the pattern of behaviors of that defines the state. We do them because we think that the state is in fact real. More to the point, if enough people did not think it was real, if enough people somehow became convinced overnight, some critical mass of people became convinced overnight that this whole thing was actually an illusion, then people would stop doing that and would stop behaving in such a way that actually is consistent with the pattern of behavior, and then the pattern of behavior wouldn't be there anymore either. So this is really crucial to my argument. There's this feedback loop between what we interpret as real and what the actual pattern of behaviors is, right? So we interpret this pattern of behaviors, saying there's this thing called the state, so I now go and I act in such and such a way, and me acting in that way and all the people around me acting in that way is what creates the pattern of behaviors that allowed me to interpret it in that way, right? So that's the feedback loop. And so there's a sense in which the state is a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy, right? The fact that we think it's there is what causes us to continue to act as if it in fact is there, and thus is actually what causes it to be there. So given everything that I've said, I hope that it's sort of clear that there's a way in which the state, which seems like this very concrete, real thing associated with buildings and politicians and important documents called laws, is something like a shared hallucination, right? There's actually nothing very concrete about it. It's this pattern of behaviors that just keeps getting manifested. And at any given moment, I mean, just speaking sort of metaphysically, at any given moment, people could just stop moving in that way and saying those things, and the whole thing would just stop, right? There's no sort of concrete reality to it. And so what gives it any reality that it in fact does have, it's just the very fact. So you can sort of trace the line of causation back to the very fact that we think it's real in the first place, right? So there's this sort of circle going on of causation. Okay, I act as if the state is there because I interpret it as being there, and I can interpret it as being there because that's how I acted. Again, obviously, this applied on a social level. This requires a certain critical mass. That's why the collective part of the collective interpretive framework is very important. What I'm saying maybe sounds trivial, or maybe sounds kind of radical. If it sounds kind of radical, there's just something I want to sort of be very clear about, is that this is just how social phenomena works. There's actually nothing that I've said so far that's really all that special about the state. I mean, some of the specifics that I've said are specific to the state, but just this twofold combo of pattern of behaviors and interpretation of that pattern of behaviors, and the fact that our interpreting the phenomenon as real is what causes the pattern of behaviors to generate that analysis. That applies to money, right? So why do people act as if money has value? Because they perceive it. They have this collective interpretive framework that tells them money is this very real, tangible, important, valuable thing. Enough people believe it and act that way that the pattern generates that is essentially what constitutes the reality of money. And so people then see and say, okay, look, money's real, and continue to act that way. And the same thing could be said about sports, about family, about all kinds of, about pretty much any social phenomenon. So even though I'm talking about anarchism, the state, the whole thing, really this basic ontological analysis of what the thing is, the broad strokes of it can be applied to any social phenomenon. So now I hope that why I started by talking about the Stanford Prison Experiment is clear, right? I started talking about the Stanford Prison Experiment because the Stanford Prison Experiment gives us a really, really stark example of this way in which social reality gets created. In a way, the way we can analyze the Stanford Prison Experiment, given what I've just said, is that what the Stanford Prison Experiment did is it took over the collective interpretive frameworks of the people participating. They started to see the world differently in a very fundamental way, in that the tints on your glasses kind of way. It happened incredibly quickly. I mean, the Stanford Prison Experiment, if nothing else, shows us how incredibly fast an environment can change the very fundamentals of how you view your reality, to the point where essentially they really did start to live in a prison, right? I mean, what they were experiencing, what they felt they could and could not do, including leave, it all became alarmingly consistent with an actual prison, given the fact that it took a matter of days, less than a week. So the way in which this reality of a prison emerges in the Stanford Prison Experiment, I think, is the best metaphor that we have for the way in which the state emerges. Now the Stanford Prison Experiment has the fact that it's kind of artificial, right? There's this beginning. People are kind of thrown into this situation. But how very quickly it takes over sort of makes it so that how it kind of started becomes besides the point. The point is that these people start to interpret the world as if they're in a prison. They start to act accordingly, and lo and behold, they really are suddenly in a prison, and they're behaving that way, and it makes sense to behave that way. The incentives are now right for them to be in a prison, and more it just makes sense to say they actually are in a prison. Why wouldn't they act like they're in a prison? This, I think, is a fantastic metaphor for how the state in general emerges and gets sustained over time. It gets sustained over time because the sense of its reality persists. So given that I'm making a case for anarchism, right? Obviously, I don't think that the state is necessary, inevitable, or legitimate. It isn't. I want to say here that there's a sense then in which it's also not real. Now, it is obvious. There's obviously a sense in which it is real. The pattern of behaviors really is there, and in fact, everything I've said. I've given an account of the ontology of the state, and I've given that account because I think it fits, because I think that the state, there is this thing that fits that account that I've just given. And so obviously in that sense also the state does exist. However, there's a sense in which it's not real, which is the fact that it has this kind of, that it's sort of this constantly self-generating thing that doesn't have any kind of concrete substantial reality to it. And so there's just that sense in which it's not quite real. It's a sort of illusion that we're all constantly seem to be sort of playing along with. So I'm going to stop here for now. So far, what I hope you've taken is my account of what the state actually is. Now, what I'm going to talk about next time is, first of all, the most immediate, obvious kind of objection that you can give to the account that I've given, which is, fine, sure, your account of the state maybe is accurate. That doesn't say anything about the fact that it's necessary, right? Any number of social phenomena, even if the account that you've given is correct, even if there's this sort of feedback loop that causes it to self-generate, what have you, may be the fact, doesn't say anything about the fact that maybe this is a necessary thing. Maybe people need to do this. People need to have this kind of collective interpretive framework and this pattern of behaviors in order for society to function normally. I'm going to address that objection. I'm going to make my case for the state as I've defined it is not actually necessary. After doing so, I'm going to then, given the account that I have given about the ontology of the state, give what I think necessarily follows as the strategy for getting rid of it. And that concludes today's episode of Who Shapes the Barber? Again, I'm William Nava. You can check out other episodes, as well as my other philosophical and artistic work at williamnava.com. And if you'd like to subscribe to this podcast, go to williamnava.podbean.com. Thank you so much for listening.